Okay, so welcome to this online Q&A about knowledge management in IT organizations. My name is Hans Laat, and I'm the founder of Ambertree. And the way it is currently set up is that I received a few questions before the Q&A that I prepared, and I will go through these, and then after we can discuss any other questions you have. And so maybe just to start, what are we talking about when we're talking about knowledge management? Knowledge management is really a system that facilitates the capture, sharing, and reuse of experience. If you go on Google and you look for definitions of knowledge management, you will find a lot of discussion, but I like this definition because I feel it's very intuitive, and especially the emphasis on experience, because what do we mean with experience? It's knowledge gained through action. So this really emphasizes that knowledge management is focused on the experience we build up every day with our organization, with our successes, sometimes with our mistakes. But this is something we gain every day, and we can really use this to continuously improve our way of working, differentiate from other companies and other organizations, and just it generally just drives improvement, makes us better at what we do. And it also positions it quite well compared to, for example, learning and development, the lean process management, and everything like that, which is all has a bit of a different focus. And what do I mean with a system? Knowledge management is often seen or very focused, or is often believed to be something that's very technology oriented. And of course, you have things like ServiceNow and SharePoint and many other systems. But knowledge management as a whole includes roles, processes, technology, and governance. Just like financial management is a system that includes all these different elements as well. And finally, the capture, share, and reuse of experience. Just to position it also a bit more, knowledge is, just so you have a bit of a working definition for knowledge, knowledge exists in the heads of people. Knowledge is things like the know what and the know how, the know why, and all these things. But it exists in the heads of people. It's what shapes your decision making. It's what shapes your actions. Information is a piece of knowledge that's been made explicit. Information exists in technology. Now, the technology can be a knowledge base or a database or something, but it can also just be paper. The point there is information exists in technology, knowledge exists in people. And there's four activities that are always happening in your organization. It'd be very weird if they didn't happen. And that knowledge management helps to improve, to systematize, to facilitate. First one is the discussions happening. Discussions, from person to person, in communities of practice, gallery walks, very maybe ad hoc knowledge sharing, very structured knowledge sharing, but it's very person to person. So those are the first group of activities. The second one, of course, documenting knowledge, creating documentation, and everything related with that. The third one is the combination of new information and old information coming to a version of truth, information lifecycle management, etc. That's all part of this activity. And at that point, we are also overlapping a lot with information management. And finally, of course, making sure people find and reuse that information, that they integrate into their knowledge, into their behavior, and that it helps them do their job. And those activities includes things like taxonomy and tagging and search engine optimization and things like that. So that's just a bit of the scope, a bit what we are talking about, what the discussion is about, and just so you have a bit of a clear definition on what knowledge management is. So the first question I received beforehand, of course, considering the current circumstances with the corona, is I got a few questions about how you deal with knowledge sharing in this home working context, and the questions were especially focused on the more ad hoc knowledge sharing. The people talking around coffee machines and all that, or sitting around the same table and just asking questions and sharing information that way. It's a bit different, of course, if you're working from home. Now you can still call people, and we have tools like WebEx and Zoom and Jabber and all these things. Communicating if you have a question isn't that difficult. And I also, it's at this point still difficult to say what the long-term consequences will be. We are still experimenting with this whole new dynamic. Also think it's not going to change very much after. I think that this idea, we've now really been forced to adapt a lot of this remote working, and I think a lot of companies and a lot of people will keep doing it. Maybe not full time anymore, but 3 or 4 days in a week. I certainly see that happening. Um, so we're still experimenting with it. It's a bit difficult to say what it will be long term. Now, there are two things that I would recommend as measures to help exactly with this, especially with this particular situation. The first one is if your company doesn't have one yet, or maybe if you have something like it to improve it, if you have an expertise finder, which is like an internal social network, but it focuses very much on what people are doing, what is their subject matter expertise, what technologies do they work with, what projects do they work with, what can people ask you questions about? Some companies, many companies, they have an organizational chart or something with the internal contact information, for example, but it doesn't often say what exactly can you ask for this person, and also can I look for people based on the questions I have. Setting this up is going to, especially short term, is going to help a lot with the internal networks of your company, because it's a bit more difficult to meet new people, to build your network inside the company organization, when you don't have that ad hoc sharing. So it becomes more important to really be able to find people. Okay, I have a question. Who should I talk to? And this will help you do that. Long term, I think very interesting is virtual reality technology to help. So virtual reality chat rooms. Right now, it's still a bit of a toy. It's still being played with, but big companies like Facebook and Microsoft and others, they are really investing in this technology, because it can, to me, it will be a new generation compared to what we have right now with Zoom and just video and audio. This will go a lot further, um, because it can, in virtual reality, there's also, you can position more. It's easier to read people and to communicate more, especially when it starts being combined with other systems as well. And that virtual way of working, it's not going to be immediate, but in the coming years, there's going to be a lot of development around it, I think. So it's interesting to keep that in mind. Now, I think we had somebody who wanted to ask a question. Somebody raised their hand. So, hello? Did you have a question? It was Florentina, right?
Yeah, it was me. I was thinking about the communities of practice when you are
Mm-hmm.
speaking about ad hoc sharing knowledge.
Yeah.
Um, because I think that the communities of practice can be a solution no matter the situation we are facing with.
Yeah.
Like in this particular case with coronavirus, um, because you're also speaking about systems or tools that can be used. Microsoft Teams, it's such a tool that can help sharing knowledge and can help creating communities of practice.
Yeah.
And this
Absolutely.
can be very useful through this time.
Yeah. Absolutely. So the communities of practice is something that you should always have in your organization, and I think they might not explicitly be called like that, but especially in larger organizations, they tend to evolve almost naturally. When people doing the same processes, same subject matter, they tend to just connect to each other and start working together and discussing and sharing. Um, but if you have a good knowledge management system, and knowledge management should include these communities, and you facilitate it right, and you optimize the processes, you can get a lot more value from it. But it's true. It's definitely not something to forget right now, because because yeah, that ad hoc sharing, not just ad hoc but also the structured one, is definitely, even especially right now, it's not just a crisis, it's also an enormous opportunity to learn, to challenge the way we work, and to rethink the way we interact with customers and everything. So yeah, it's definitely a very useful thing. Okay, so that was one question. So in terms of knowledge sharing, there's a lot of a lot of possibilities, and we will definitely see more in the future. So expertise finders, very useful, and chat rooms will, and VR technology in general, I think it will become much bigger in the future as well, for knowledge management and knowledge sharing. The second, there was a lot of questions about documentation actually, and documentation is a very complex topic because on one hand you have people asking, okay, we create a lot of documentation, but a lot of it isn't used, or we can't find the right information when we need it and everything. On the other hand, paradoxically, it's saying, you have people asking, we don't create enough documentation. How can I motivate people to document more? It's a complex topic because there can be a lot of reasons for it. But there are a few, so we would have to look, if we want to really solve it for your circumstances, we would have to look into your specific organization and see what is happening there. And we can definitely discuss this after the Q&A. But generally speaking, I want to give a few pointers on how you can optimize the return on investment of documenting things. Now, the first one, and definitely the most important one, is to think of documentation problems or documentation challenges not as documentation focused, but communication focused. And if you think of it as a communication problem, then you can start thinking in terms of, okay, who are we trying to communicate with? Who is this documentation for? What are we trying to say with this? Is it for our own team? Are we trying to use it as a reference that we can, as a reminder, as a kind of way to standardize our way of working? Is it for another technical team? Is it for a business team? Is it for our customers? Who is it for, and what do we want to achieve with this? Is it maybe, are we trying to prevent problems? And if so, is this documentation actually helping us do this? Is the formatting correct? Is the language correct? Are we creating this aimed at the context of who we're creating for? Should we even create documentation? How should we deliver it? Should we push it? Should we like constantly inform people and send the documentation to people? Or should we just make it available and inform people if there's an update? Which is actually a better system, often a better system, because if you push information to people, they will only remember it if it's at that point, right when relevant for them and they need it at that time. Also, maybe the documentation you have, we often think about it as text, but why not videos? Why not audio? Why not some other format, especially if you're thinking on how-tos and process documentation? Maybe video or audio works better, works even best. So thinking of documentation as a communication challenge is a better way of doing it. Documentation, is really just the medium by which you communicate. The second one is documentation is not just is a big concept, but thinking, okay, really deciding what kind of documentation is it? Is it system documentation, which describes a system, which is often tied to architecture and data models and things like that, which is mainly aimed at providing an overview or an easy reference for, okay, how is this system set up exactly? Is it process documentation, which is supposed to help people achieve certain tasks as efficiently and as effective as possible? Or is it user documentation, which in practice is mostly like process documentation, but there you have to specifically pay attention also to making sure, well, users usually don't have your technical context, so you have to think of it in a different way, you have to maintain it in a different way. You also cannot really ask your end users to write documentation for you, which is something you can do with process and system documentation, of course. But distinguishing between these three types of documentation also helps you clarify what the issue is and what it's supposed to do. So of course, it ties into the first point again. A third point is to do documentation is a principle of demand driven. A lot of time we tend to create documentation just in case somebody will need to use it, rather than just in time based on actual demand. And while it is counterintuitive to do it only when you get a question, it's a big investment in time and energy to create documentation and then maintain that documentation. So you should do it only when there's an actual question. For example, if you have a help desk or something, trying to anticipate what end users or other teams will ask or what they will need is pointless. You're not one of these end users. You have a different context. And the only way to really do it is to base yourself on, for example, the user acceptance testing, because those were actually users testing your system. The question they ask really come from their perspective and their background. So the better way to do it is create a document or documentation for self-service when and if you've actually received that question. And that actually ties me to the next point as well. You don't have to have review cycles or something. Depends a bit on the documentation. Some documentation, especially when it comes to compliance or security, or really that you have to have an absolute assurance that it's still accurate. You might have a review cycle, but these are usually exceptions. It's a better thing to say to build up a collective sense of ownership, meaning that everybody who uses documentation is also responsible for the documentation. There's not a single document owner, for example. And then there's the idea it's called flag it or fix it, meaning that if you use a document and you see something that is not accurate, or you don't understand it, or you just say like, I don't trust this document, I'm not sure this is correct, it's your responsibility either to flag. If you don't have the license, the rights to change it, then you should flag it to whoever has the rights, that the document, that there's something wrong, it should be changed, and propose your change. But if you do have that right, then you should fix it. It's not for your colleagues. It's you are responsible for doing it, and everybody's responsible for doing it. So yeah, that's an important thing, and that means that your documentation. So those two, like the demand-driven and the review principles, ensure that the documentation you have is relevant, that you're not going to maintain and put effort in maintaining documentation that is not really used, even though you might think, well, people will likely ask these questions. If they don't, they don't. There's no point in providing information or making information available that that isn't asked for, because the only thing you're doing is you're only driving the quality of your search functionality down. The more information there is in the search, in the knowledge base, the more inefficient and ineffective your search engine will become. It's often a thing like, why does our knowledge base, why does it not just work like Google? Why Google gets good results? Yeah, well, gets good results because, first of all, the internet is a very standard format. It's mostly HTML. Content there is designed to be found. And also Google has hundreds of people working full time to always optimize their search engine. So unless your company is willing to make that investment, you shouldn't expect the same level of search engine quality. So keep it simple. Keep your documentation very pragmatic. And this actually goes to the last point, and I like to refer to this quote. This sense of ownership and the sense of knowledge sharing, in the fact that we are all involved in it, it's a network, after all, there's this quote from Bob Buckman who said that the people who engage in active and effective knowledge sharing across the organization should be the only ones considered for promotion. And what this means is that we all have a job, we all follow certain processes, but if that's all you do, you're basically you have no more added value than having a machine do it. You have an input, you have an output, you have an input, you have an output. Your added value as an expert, as somebody with experience, is the fact is you can actually say, you can think ahead and say, okay, how can we make this service more valuable? So, for example, if you're a help desk, the idea is that you're as a help desk, or you're your job is not to solve problems. Your job is to prevent problems by saying, okay, we have received this question. If we have received this issue, can we make sure that this doesn't happen anymore? Is it an issue that an end user could solve themselves if they knew how? Then we should actually create them. And that's how you create added value, because that reduces, the number of incidents you have. That allows you to do more strategic work and everything. But that mentality is is something you have to build up. We still have a bit the tendency of calling an expert and rewarding an expert based on what they know and what they do, the problems they solve, rather than the knowledge they share and their ability to create new experts, which is actually a kind of a backwards way. It works very well if you're all part of a machine and you're standing in a production line or something, but as knowledge workers, it doesn't work very well. So that's just a few principles about documentation. Again, it's a complex topic, and we have to look in specific organizations if there's specific problems. Oh, the next one is about knowledge bases. I received a few questions about, okay, what should we do to set up a good knowledge base. I'm going to check the time actually. There's a few principles as well. First of all, a knowledge base is a platform. It's a technology. If it's SharePoint, ServiceNow, Documentum, other things. And you should think of it as a knowledge base, as really it has to be part of a larger system. I actually showed you the 4 parts. So your knowledge base and its processes of creating, of combining, and of reusing the information should connect to your community of practice or to your users. This should be a kind of cycle, and you should really think about it as a part of a larger system. A lot of knowledge management is really based on, like, we're going to create a SharePoint, we're going to design it and roll it out, and then people will use it. And well, no, it doesn't work like that. Really, it's really supposed to be a communication tool again. So thinking of it like as this larger system is definitely something to keep in mind. And part of that is all, and the second part is that a knowledge base, there's just a bit of a tendency of trying to build a knowledge base as a library of everything in the company, everything in IT, but also everything in the company. But that leads you to a knowledge base that ultimately becomes so big, so complicated, that is trying to do everything and help everyone, that it doesn't do anything anymore. It's far better to have a knowledge base which is much smaller in scope, that has a specific purpose of helping specific users, than having such a big system. And if necessary, you create a lot of smaller knowledge bases and connect them with links or something. So, for example, you could have a knowledge base for project management methodology. You could have one for the business analysis methodology. You could have one for your development methodology. A lot of these different things. Now, in practice, and the best way would be just to link the different parts together as much as possible. A lot of these processes also tend to connect. So in practice, it doesn't always work very well, but it's a good thing to strive towards. And at the very least, defining specifically what your knowledge base is supposed to accomplish, what the scope is, and really keeping in mind who are the users, because the needs and the profiles is going to be very third part is, well, it's something that's supposed to help specific users, so involve these users from the start. And in fact, ideally, they are leading the design and the design and the implementation of it, because it's a tool that's supposed to help them. If you, for example, say we want to create a knowledge base for our support agents or for our project managers, but they are really not excited about this, they're really not interested in committing to this and helping with this, or actually taking ownership for this as they should do, then either there's a question of, do they see the purpose at all? Is there something that they don't see the benefit of it? And then you might have to investigate more what they need, or why do they reject the concept even? Or maybe maybe you just need to sell it more. Maybe you need to look for a few success stories first, find those people, those champions that are always interested. Maybe there's already something, a de facto knowledge base that you can adapt and expand on. But engaging these users is very important. Engaging your end users and building it for them and with them is very important. In terms of setting it up, one of the more intuitive ways of doing it is to define categories. Like in Windows, you have different folder structures. Like you could say we make one per team and then per technology or per project. The problem is that a structure like this is very static. And your organization changes, your needs change and everything. And moreover, if you, for example, then have documentation, you say, okay, this document fits in this box, in this category. But sooner or later, there's going to be documentation that fits in other boxes as well. What do you do then? You create links, or do um, you create duplicates? If you create links between documents, well, then if you say, okay, we have two different teams, but who's responsible for this team? Is everyone responsible for this team, as I mentioned? Should it be one person? Ideally, it would be everyone, of course, but it makes it very complicated if you have documentation that becomes duplicated like that. Instead, the better way to do it as much as possible is to use a systems of tags. So you can have a tag hierarchical tag line, for example, of different teams, of security levels, of related technologies, projects, clients, and everything. And documents can have one or more tags, and you can remove the tags and you can change the tags. And people can search not by looking through a hierarchy, but they search specifically on content, on specific tags. That's a much more natural way of thinking about information and looking for information, because we don't organize our knowledge, in our heads. We don't organize it in boxes either. We relate things, we relate projects to technologies, to people, to. It's a much more natural way of searching, not a natural way of keeping information, and a much more natural way of managing the information as well. And finally, in terms of specifically of content, and especially if you're doing with process documentation, it's good to set it up according to a must, should, could structure. Must being the absolutely crucial things you have to do to fulfill the process, which is usually things involving security, maybe compliance and everything. And must, ideally, you set it as a checklist, not like you have to do this, then you have to do this, then you have to do this. No, it should be set to complete this process. You must have taken these steps. So that's what's the bare bones that you need to have done to complete this, to get the result you want. If you, the should content, so you have the must, and then the should is good practices. Now, you must, for example, if you're a designer, you must make sure that the developers know the requirements or the user requirements. You should use this template because it's structured, because we know it. You should do this. It's a good practice. It's not something that's a must, but you should do it because it's just the most efficient. It's the best practice we have. Could is a tips and tricks. If, for example, you could say, if you're a designer or you're a business analyst and you're gathering requirements for development, you must you must inform the developers of the user requirements. You should use this template, and you could write it in French because our developers are in France, for example. You don't have to do it because they speak English and understand it, but if you write it in French, it's a bit more valuable to them. You could do this, but you don't have to do this. It's a trick. So having that kind of differentiation is good. Also, because if you start asking like, okay, what is a must, what is a should, and what is a good, it's a good discussion to have with, in terms of knowledge sharing. Okay, what is really the essence of our process? What do we really have to do? Is this really crucial, or is it really like we're just doing it because we're used to it, or it's because it's convenient? So if you're designing a knowledge base or improving a knowledge base, trying to organize your content and like this is very useful because it also encourages the discussion and that knowledge sharing, that thinking about what do we do, and is this really the best way we're doing it? Could we do it differently? Could we do it better? So even while you're creating a knowledge base, you're creating knowledge, you're creating insights. I think I'm going to have to speed it up a bit. Yeah. Questions about frameworks. What frameworks exist? Why do you need a framework? Framework is, well, it helps you to put everything together, create clarity, because knowledge management can be very complex, different. It's difficult to position often, but a framework say, okay, this is what we want, this is how it's structured, this is the kind of how does our knowledge management house going to look? Where is every room? What is the purpose of every room? Why do we put it like this? How do we how do the roles and the processes and the technology and the governance relate? What is in scope? What is not? How does it connect with other fields? So having a good framework is definitely an added benefit. Also, well, it clarifies it for you, but it also clarifies it for your stakeholders. If you use a framework that exists on the market, it also has the added advantage that you don't have to reinvent everything. You can start with something that exists. Plus, if other organizations are using the same framework, it's easy to share good practices and learn from each other as well. So I definitely recommend it. Now, in knowledge management, there's not yet something like an ITIL or a Prince2 or a TOGAF or something, a framework that is universally used in a sense that I take this training, for example, I take a Prince2 training and now I'm a certified project manager. That doesn't exist yet for knowledge management. Maybe it never will. But there are two frameworks, two models that I would recommend that I also use myself. The first one is I have a framework based on the ISO 30401 knowledge management standard. So there's an ISO standard for knowledge management systems since 2018. And that's really just like an ISO standard. It covers, okay, your knowledge management system must have these things and should have these elements. It's a bit higher level, but it's good to align towards. And I personally use a framework um, based on it, especially when I'm dealing with process and project competence improvement, or the improvement of our ability to our efficiency with certain processes and projects and all that. The second one I use and recommend is a KCS, Knowledge Centered Service, which is especially useful if you're doing knowledge management in the context of ETIL, improving self-service and things like that, and creating documentation for other teams or for users. And it's also if you have a knowledge service, for example, a help desk, that is very based on informing other people. Like if you get a lot of questions of how do I reset my password or how do I do this or do this, that's not really something that's something that they probably could do themselves if they just know how. And KCS is a model that covers that lets you say, okay, how can we make sure that we document the right things at the right time, make it available? How do we handle ownership? Um, and it exists in there's two loops. It's a two loop model. You have the solve loop, which is about, again, capturing, structuring, reusing, and improving documentation information. And the evolve loop is about improving your solve loop. So it's a model that is also based on constantly improving your own processes. So it's very valuable. It's not very difficult either. So I definitely recommend it. Also, if you use ServiceNow, then ServiceNow is a KCS verified tool, so you can implement it there. And there's also other tools, other service tools that are verified. Now you can check if your tool is KCS verified on the KCS website as well. And yes, those were kind of the questions I received beforehand. So they were about dealing with knowledge sharing and home working, optimizing documentation, what kind of frameworks exist, how do you building knowledge base, and yeah. So I have a few more questions I received beforehand, but maybe I can unmute. If you have any questions, I can unmute you and let's see how that is. If anyone has a question, and we actually have chat. No. Otherwise, I still have a few other questions, but I don't have slides for them.
No questions from my side.
No.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I did get a few other questions beforehand. For example, what types of certifications would improve the capabilities of an IT knowledge manager? Well, as I said, there's not a knowledge management like a universal world knowledge management training. There are knowledge management trainings definitely in universities, and in America you have also the KM, the Knowledge Management Institute, for example. Um, Now, I think it's always helpful to take these courses and everything to just dig into the subject matter because there's a lot of perspectives and you can probably find something useful for yourself. But as a knowledge manager, what I would recommend in IT is to become a bit of, or at least learn the foundations of what the subject matter you're dealing with, just so you can connect more easily with the people you're working with. So if you're working in a service context, then getting an ITIL certification is definitely useful. If you're working a lot with project managers, then learning about Prince2 or whatever methodology they base themselves on is useful. For business analysts, BPMN, just to be able to start understand like how do they describe processes and everything. KCS, of course, I would definitely. That's it. You can also get certified in that, so I would recommend it. Especially if you're saying like, okay, that's a specific knowledge management methodology. And at this point, yeah, you could get certified as an ISO auditor for the 30401, but then you're an auditor rather than a knowledge manager. Another one I have is in this fast-changing world, how do you ensure people are up to date and people have time to be informed? Now, that's actually two questions there. First of all, how do you ensure people are up to date? Well, if we ask that question, what do you mean with being up to date? And for me, this means that people know what they need to know to make the right decisions. And you can't really force this. The only way to so there's a question of pushing information versus pulling information. If you push information that they don't need right then, and you're pushing it with the mentality that if they do this, they should know this, nobody's going to remember this because you don't absorb information you don't need right then and there. You can, but the better way of doing it was making sure that this information is available and making sure that people know how to find it and really creating the mentality and the behavior of saying, before I do anything, I will check my documentation because this documentation might have been updated. So it's the idea, the learning before, during, and after idea. That before you do anything, even if it's mostly a routine, I will still check first, is there a process, has the process changed? Am I supposed to follow anything else? Is there a new insight? Which, of course, if you're dealing with a help desk and you're solving problems that are 5 minutes, it's a bit, might be a bit too stringent. But if you're really doing projects of 6 months or more, then you should never assume that okay, I know how to do it, and check the information that is there. What if other people collected? Has anything been contributed? Then yeah, making sure that how do you ensure people are up to date? Well, create in your people the mentality that they should keep themselves up to date, and they should really have the mentality of making sure and challenging, like, okay, I'm going to do this. Is what am I going to do it in the best possible way? Do I have every information? And the second part of the question was, how do I make sure that people have the time to be informed? Well, the only way to do that is to give them the time to be informed, which is give people the time to do research, to investigate before they do something, which is an investment, of course, but it really does pay off because it avoids a lot of mistakes, a lot of rework, a lot of things that could have been avoided. It's not always it's not always easy to get people to do this, and especially to sell this towards management, because of course that takes time, and time you're not not specifically, or at least visibly doing the process at least. But yeah, it's just knowledge sharing is an investment. Learning is an investment. It pays off a lot, but you do have to make the investment in time, especially. Do I have any other questions? I received a question: how do you share experience between seniors and juniors? So how do you most effectively do the knowledge sharing from senior people to junior people. First of all, this isn't a one way knowledge sharing. I think there's always new insights and everything to be gained as well from junior people to senior people. But generally, I would say put people together and have them have discussions and really about raising the right questions, not just about how do I do this, really more about why are we doing it this way? What are the alternatives? What are things you learn now that you wish you knew earlier? What is the context here? Who are the people I need to know? Who should I talk to? Who can I talk to about this? Who can I talk to about this? That's the first thing, really asking about context, because it's that context that is really the value of experience. The technical skills, the technical processes is usually less of a problem. That's something you do it once and then you know it and you get better at it. But what's really lost with experienced people is that historical context and also the network that these people have. Like, who can I talk to? Who can help me with this? So that's really something to focus on and just having those conversations. Second of all is in terms of documentation. A lot of people will say, okay, we want our seniors to create documentation for our juniors. That's actually, I would recommend against it. Because if you've been working in a company for 20, 30, 40 years, you no longer have any context, you no longer have any, you don't know what it is like to just start working or even to be just new. It doesn't have to be somebody just graduated, but somebody who's new in the company. Even if it's 6 months or a year, the longer it gets, the less you understand anymore what it is like to be in that position. A lot of the things you know and they're absolutely natural for you, or maybe not natural for a starter, or not really, they don't make much, or not logical, but you don't even remember it anymore because you've just internalized it. So in terms of documentation, um, let your juniors create documentation. Let them document what they learn and document the answers to their questions. And again, that goes back to the demand-driven principle I explained earlier. Um, and then base your start, especially if you're thinking this in the context of building an onboarding system, onboarding process, something that's going to be used and used again. One of the ways to do it, well, one of the ways I did it with another client was that she was building a knowledge portal on the big internet, and there was a lot of information about the company, and she was building a portal saying, okay, I want to create something for the juniors. They always have the same questions, so I'm going to, build this nice portal where they can find anything. But, and she asked me for help with this. When I said that, well, we should not do this. We're not starters anymore. We don't know what these people need to know. So instead, what we should do is we're going to use our functionality of internet or intranet functionality had a Q&A module. So people can ask questions, other people can ask to it. Even experts can give answers. And instead of building a portal, we're going to use this Q&A module. Starters can ask questions from each other, especially because then you're peer-to-peer communication, which is even more relevant. And your role will be to distill this data, these questions, into an FAQ document or an FAQ portal, let's say. You can start with a document, and once there's a lot of information in there, maybe you have to restructure it into different categories, but you can start with just a document. It's very approachable, it's very simple, and it really creates information based on actual demand from your newcomers, from your starters. And so that makes it much more relevant. And of course, especially for newcomers, it's not just about the FAQ. I would recommend, build a community of practice for newcomers in a sense, or just a community. The platform is a tool, but it also helps create that community and, helps people become integrated into the organization. And so that's another advantage. So that's what I would recommend in terms of knowledge sharing between seniors and juniors is let juniors pull this instead of pull the information they need instead of pushing the information they need, except for the things that are not that they really need to know from day one, for example. But even then, what do you need to know on day one? What do you need to know in the first week? What do you need to know after the third month? there's not a lot of point in pushing information that they don't need in the first week. So yeah, that's a few points there. And I think that's just about the questions I have. Are there any other questions?
No questions.
No questions?
No.
Well, if you have anything else later, I take my slides. There we go. If you have any other questions later, you can always contact me, hans.laats@ambertree.consulting or ambertree.co, that also works. You can find me on LinkedIn. Also ambertree.co or consulting, you can find a lot more information, and I regularly try to publish something on a blog or an interview or something. You can find more there. Yeah, and I think that's just about, yeah, that wraps it about up. So thank you all for joining. I'm not sure if my camera still works. Yeah. So thank you all for joining. I hope it was very useful for you. I will soon publish a recording of this session or the previous session, not the same questions. So thank you for joining, and I hope you have a nice day.
Great, thank you too. Thank you, Hans,
You're
for the
welcome.
information you've shared.
You're welcome.